So we're going to get into some slightly more advanced things in SQL. So far we've just been selecting data, but let's do some operations on data to put it together, chop and change it a bit to meet our needs. So we're going to start off with exploring the type of operations we can do on text columns in SQL. We're going to look at concatenation, which is a big fancy word for taking two pieces of text and putting them together, like text from column A and column B, and put them together. Sounds like a Chinese menu, doesn't it? Also, we'll be looking at getting parts of text, like getting some letters from the beginning or the middle or the end of a piece of text and doing all sorts of crazy stuff with it. Searching a piece of text, searching within a piece of text for a letter or letters, and replacing some of the text within a text value in a column to change it up a bit to meet our needs. Now, in the course of this work, you may well hear the term strings. Strings, especially in some of the functions and commands that we're going to be using, you may hear me refer to the word strings, or the function names, the code refer to the word strings. What the heck are strings? Well, strings are just bunches of text. That's all they are. The term string actually means it's a string of letters, stringing a bunch of letters together to make up a word or words or a sentence. That's all it means. So let's get into operations on text. Now, if you've closed down Management Studio and gone away and come back, I'll take you through reopening it again as a reminder. So I'm going to fire up a Management Studio off my taskbar, or you can fire it off the Start menu. And we just click connect at this little connection log-on dialog box, as we do. Now, in the left-hand Object Explorer pane, we'll just expand databases and just expand AdventureWorks there and expand the tables, and we'll just scroll down to person.person, which we've been working with, and we'll apply what we've learned about column types. So we're going to expand the table and the columns, and we'll look at some of these data types. What have we got here? Well, business entity, it's got the word int in there. That tells us it is an int. It is a numeric, so that's a numeric. Person type, again, that's nchar. We learned that was a text type. Name style, that's a bit. Title, that's an nchar. That's a text. And middle name, last name, all of them text. So they're the kind of ones we're going to be working with in these operations, experimenting with operations on text data types. So I'll open up a new query window, and we'll start off with the basics. We're going to select, I'll select all of them to start off with, and we'll make a decision. I'll make it caps for consistency, and I'll go select star. Star means all the columns from person. Now I'll just put an alias on the end there. We learned about aliases in an earlier lesson, which is just a shorthand name for the table, and it will make life easier for us later on when we do some more advanced commands involving the table. But let's just continue on. We won't worry about a where clause for the moment, but we will put an order by clause, even though an order by clause is not mandatory. It would have worked with just the select and the from clause, but it's considered good practice to put in an order by clause. So we'll select the prime key, which was business entity ID, and we'll specify whether it's ascending or descending by putting ASK. Now, as a bit of a tip here for you, if we go over to the Object Explorer, we can tell which of the fields is the key. I know I said it's pretty much always the first one mentioned in the list, but there's another way as well, is that the prime key has a little icon of a key right next to it, so that always tells us it's a key. Just a bit of a tip there for you. But with that query there, we'll execute it. Okay, there's our data. So let's say we want to do a mailing label report in Crystal Reports, and we want to print out right next to each other the first name and the last name as one column. And if you've ever done report writing, if you've got the first name and last name in its own column, that's actually going to show up in Crystal Reports or any other report writer as one unit of text that you can put together as one piece together and not have two of them, the first name and the last name. How are we going to do that? Well, I'll tell you what, let's put it at the very front of our columns here. It's perfectly legitimate. It is perfectly legitimate to have columns appear in our query more than once. So let's just, purely for ease of finding it, let's put the first name as the first column on the far left there and all the other columns on the left, just to leave them there just so we can check them out. So we'll put first name, and hey presto, IntelliSense has filled it in for us. And you know what? Let's put last name as well. I won't use the IntelliSense, I'll just leave it like it is in caps lock, and we'll execute it. And there we go, first name and last name, and all of them, they appear more than once in the set. That is perfectly legitimate. As we get more advanced, there are certain very unique circumstances where you're not allowed to have columns more than once in a results set, in the query results. But we'll come to those much later in the course. For now, it's okay to have the same column more than once. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to combine first and last name into one big long run together name. So we want Ken Sanchez to appear as Ken Sanchez in one column and Terry Duffy as one. And you know what? I'm going to jump straight in and show you how to do it. So, and this is a little bit funny. We're going to go first name plus last name. Now that may look a bit funny. You're probably thinking, well, hang on, they're text columns. How can you add a column to another, one piece of text to another? How is that even possible? I mean, they're not numbers. Well, take my word for it, and we'll just look at the result. Okay, what's just happened? Instead of having those two columns there, we've now got one column. It doesn't have a name, and we've got all those words run together. There's one problem though. They actually run together without a space in between them. We'll fix that later, but let's just talk about what we've got. What we've got is what's called an expression column. Now what an expression column is, it's not a real column. It doesn't physically exist in the database. We haven't physically created another column. There isn't another column there. We've still got the same number of physical columns that we had before. But it is basically just an extra sort of, it's almost like a mathematical product. It's one that we've made up, and we can make up any sort of expression column using the various operations and commands available to us in SQL. But if we were to take this query and plug it into Crystal Reports, that column would be available to us, and we could drop and drag it onto our report just like any of the other ones right there. If we do one last thing, and that is to give it a name. At the moment it's got no column name. If we were to take this and plug it into Crystal Reports or some report writers, they may actually throw an error and not work in with it. So it's important and always good practice that expression column names have a name. So you know what, let's just call it full name, and I'll tell you how to actually call something. It's using the word as, and I'm going to call that name. Now there's generally a bunch of rules about the name that you can give an expression column. Generally they have to start with a letter. They can't contain certain characters, such for example mathematical operators like backslash or plus or something like that. If I was to execute that, we've got an error. So anything involving special commands, there are some special commands in SQL. If I was, for example, to call that order, I think that wouldn't work actually, or table, I think that actually wouldn't work. No, because table is a special word in SQL. So if there's a special command in SQL, or a mathematical operator, you can't use that in a column name because it confuses SQL. It thinks, well, hang on, he's telling me plus divided by, but does he actually want me to use that as an arithmetical operator or as an actual column name? So it's confusing SQL. So basically, if you come up with an expression column and it's surrounded with, it's underlined in red, you know you've done something wrong. Apart from using special SQL commands, The only other real requirement is that it start with a letter. So let's just call it full name. It is possible to have numbers on the end, but the first character in the expression name must be a letter. So let's just call it full name. I'll just run that, and hey presto, we've got our expression column, and there it is, full name. So what we've created, just to recap, is an expression column. It's a column that we make up. We create it on the fly using any one of a number of SQL commands to create, shape, and chop and change the data within it. It only exists for the duration of the query. We're not creating a new physical column. It's only for the duration of the query, and after we've finished with the query, it doesn't exist anymore. The name of the expression column can't contain any SQL commands, such as arithmetic operators, and it has to start with a letter. Now you've probably noticed there's a little bit of an issue with our expression column there, in that with these names there is actually no space between the first name and the last name. So let's insert one in there. Let's modify our expression to have a space between the first and last name. Now this is how we're going to do it. Okay. Quote, space, quote, and a plus. So what does our expression read now? First name plus concatenation. Plus means concatenating when we're dealing with text columns, and a space surrounded by single quotes. We've seen the use of single quotes in our where clauses when we're comparing values to text fields. This is the same thing, only this time it's what we call a constant. So it's not like a column. The whole expression is can be made up of columns, as we've seen here, the first name and the last name, but it can also be made up of constants. It can be a space, and you can have letters in there as well. So we may mess around with that in a minute, but for the time being, it's first name plus a space plus the last name, and the name of the column is full name. Let's see how that looks. Great, that's looking a little bit better. Okay, now like I said, we can put some text in here. For example, the requirement might be that we've got to have a hyphen between the first and last name. Not quite sure why, but it may happen. So we can put a hyphen in there, and the hyphen's there. It's a text constant. We can put anything we want in there. Okay, so let's just leave that as a space for the time being. Great, looking pretty good. Now, let's say the requirement is to have not the full first name, but just the first letter, the initial of the first name. So it reads, in the case of, say, Ken Sanchez down here, it's going to read K Sanchez. How do we do that? Well, that's when we start getting into functions. So what is a function? Well, a function in the SQL language is a lot like a function in Excel, for example, if you've ever used those. It is a command that is actually stored inside a database. That command accepts inputs, possibly one or more than one. It performs operations on those inputs, all sorts of chops and changes them, or adds them, subtracts them, whatever. And it returns a result. It only returns one result, or, and this is a bit advanced, a table. It can return a table, a result set, but that's an advanced topic. We'll get to that in a more advanced course. The SQL language comes with a whole bunch of built-in functions, which are very, very useful, but it actually is possible to make up our own custom functions, surprise, surprise, and it is stored in the database. That is a more advanced topic which we may get to later on in a later course if you're still with me, and I hope you are. So let's try using a function to get us what we want, which is the very first character of the first name. Going over to Ken, we want the capital K in Ken instead of first name. So we're going to use a function to do that, and this is how we're going to do it. So I'll just write it and then we'll talk about it in a second. Okay, what did I just write? Left, first name, comma, 1 in brackets. And you know what? I'll just execute it and then talk a bit about what I've done. Oh, check that out. There's our first initial. K Sanchez, T Duffy, R Tamburello. Fantastic, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to break down exactly what it is that I have written here in writing my function. Well, first off, I wrote the word left. That is the name of the function. It's one of the built-in functions in SQL. And just to give you a bit of background, what it does is it takes a bit of text and it returns a certain number of characters starting from the left-hand side of the piece of text. It can be the first character, or the first 2 characters, or the first 3 characters, or what have you. But how did I write it? Well, started off writing the name of the function, left, and then a bracket. And that's what functions do. They basically they follow the form, and I'm going to write it down here. Okay, so the basic form is the function name, a bracket, some inputs that may or may not be optional. There are some functions that don't accept any inputs. They just spit out a result. So inputs, and then possibly some more inputs, and then that's what those 3 dots there are meant to represent, possibly more inputs. You can have 2, 3, 4. Some functions can accept many inputs, but they always end with a closed bracket. So it's function name, open bracket, 1 or more inputs, and a closed bracket. Well, I'll just get rid of that, and we'll just talk about the function that we just wrote. So it's left, and the first parameter is the bit of text that we want to analyze. In this case, it is the column. And the next bit of parameter, and the parameters are always separated by a comma. And the second parameter is the number of characters in the left of the piece of text that we want to extract. And of course, we close it with a bracket. So that's it. So looking at the result, and there's actually a very quick way to find what the parameters are without having to look them up on Google or anywhere else. So I'll talk about that in a second, but let's look at the result. Now you may have noticed, and this is the important part, is that that function is different for every row. So again, kind of like you put functions in Excel, that is, the result is contextual depending on the row that you're on. So it executes that individually for each row. So you get the idea. Now, I'm just going to write that again. I'm going to wipe that out. I'm going to write it again. I'm going to show you a cool way to work out what the parameters are. Now, we've got to have our IntelliSense switched on. That's this little bit of a reminder there. That's this little button that looks like sort of an upright refrigerator. So with that switched on, we'll start writing our function. Okay, left, open bracket. Now because I've said open bracket, IntelliSense knows, oh, he's writing a function. I'll give him a hand. And it will actually spell out a kind of an instruction manual for the parameters and the output. We actually call that metadata, sometimes called the a function definition. So it's telling us that the first parameter is an expression of some sort. Now when it says expression, it actually really means any piece of text that evaluates to, any object that evaluates to a piece of text, and it actually tells you the data type. Now we come back to data types and column types here. Now we saw before that nvarchar is a text data type, so basically that can accept any piece of text. It actually doesn't matter that the column that we're taking that from, first name that we're about to put in there, it doesn't actually have to be an nvarchar. It actually doesn't have to. It can actually be any sort of text data type. Basically, if it's a text data type, it'll work, because SQL Server is smart enough to sort of do a bit of on-the-fly conversion in the background. So take it as read that if the data type of the parameter is one of these many text data types that we saw in that PowerPoint slide earlier, as long as what we pass in is text, it will work. Okay, so it's asking for an expression. That expression can be constant text, or it can be a column. And then the definition goes on. It's a comma and number of characters, and the data type for that second parameter is an int or integer. And it actually tells us what the output is going to be. Returns nvarchar. So let's just give that a go. So we're going to put in an expression, in this case, first name and comma, and we want the 1, as we saw before. So, and there we go. We could have some fun with this. We could make that the first two characters. And there's your first two characters. Now, I'll talk about some other really common, cool, I'll put that back, I'll make that one. Now let's say the requirement is that to be a proper a title or a mailing title of some sort, an addressing title, it's actually got to go at first initial and a period or a dot or a full stop, whoever you want to call it, followed by the surname. So how do we achieve that? Well, we've got our first initial, we've got the last name, and we've got a space. So how do we insert that dot? Well, I bet you can guess how. Just put a period in there. So let's just leave our query for the time being. We'll save it first. We'll go File, Save As, and I'll get you to save that in the folder of your choosing, and we'll call that My Person Query. I've already got one there. Great. And we'll close that, ready for the next query, which we'll do an exercise involving getting sections of a string and replacing parts of a string. So we'll start a new query window. And we'll start by, what we're going to do is we're going to select all the columns from the table production.product. Now I can tell by browsing the table's columns that product ID with that little key symbol next to it is the prime key of the table. So I've ordered the result set by that key. And let's just have a look. So we've got a name column here. Now if we scroll down the list of products, we can see that there's some of them have the second word as not in the product name. Now let's say there's a requirement that we need to find all the products that follow that particular text pattern, i.e. Not just that the second word in the name is not, but that not is after a 3-character word. In other words, not is the 4th character in that string. So we're looking where the characters at positions 4 through to and 3 after it follow that pattern of not. So let's see, how can we do that? We'll do it with a function called substring. So we'll do it and then discuss it. Okay, what's just happened? There's a little expression column, and if we go down to the nuts, there we go. We've extracted just the word nut, just that very part of it. So what's just happened with this substring here is substring takes a certain slice of a piece of text. It accepts these parameters, the expression or the column that we want to apply it to, the starting position at which we want to start getting our piece of text. In this case it's number 5, so it starts at position 5. Now the thing about substring is it's one of these functions where when it's counting characters or counting something in a series, it starts at 1. So the first character is treated at 1 as 1. So H is 1, E is 1, H is 1, E is 2, X is 3, the space is 4, and the first character we want to extract, nut, is 5. The third and last parameter is the number of characters in that string starting from the start one that we identify here that we want to extract, so that's 3. So that's how we got our word nut. So if we want to identify just those, we just take that expression and we'll put it into our where clause. Bearing in mind, as I've said before, that SQL Server is by default case insensitive, so that word capitals nut equals title case nut. So yes, that will get us what we want. And there we go, there's about 23 of them. So let's say the requirement is that now that we've identified the records we're interested in, the ones with not in that particular spot, we want to fix the name. We want to replace the word nut with something else. Let's say bolt, because let's say there was a mistake and they're not supposed to be nuts, they're supposed to be bolts. So how do we do that? Well, first off, let's get our nut name and just get it out of the select list because it's served its purpose. It's in the where clause there. So we want to take name and we want to replace part of it, and that is using a function called, strangely enough, replace. So let's type it and then we'll discuss it. So what have we typed here? We've got replace, we're putting into it the name column. We're going to And what it does is the second parameter, this is the piece of text that is going to be searched for, and that is what's going to replace it. So the metadata of the function is what we're going to search, what we're going to search for, and what we're going to replace that with. So let's just look at the results. Okay, where it says hex nut 5, it now says hex bolt 5, bolt 7, so on and so forth. A fairly powerful function, I'm sure you'll agree. So let's recap what we've learned. We talked about expression columns, which are made-up columns that we can create using SQL code. We talked about concatenating pieces of strings by using the plus operator. And we can concatenate both existing physical columns and constant values that we make up, like the quote.quote. We talked about the use of functions in SQL, and we saw some examples of functions such as left, substring, and replace. And we're going to cover more and more powerful text functions later in the course.